Hi, I'm Molly Harry. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Arkansas. And today I'm going to be discussing college athletes' experiences during the coronavirus pandemic. So this is going to take a little bit of a critical lens of the NCAA, and I'm excited for y'all to join me on this ride. So to get started, the NCAA athletes often feel exploited and used for commercial reasons that further support financially college athletics. This is particularly true of those competing in the revenue generating sports, which are traditionally football and men's basketball. And we're starting to see a few other sports generate revenue like men's ice hockey, baseball, and women's basketball as well. But we'll be primarily focusing on football and men's basketball today. These commercial components of athletics were really emphasized during the pandemic. Most institutions, particularly Division I institutions that are highly commercialized, brought back athletes to campus while their non-athlete peers were allowed to stay home. So athletes were really what we like to say in a category of their own, I suppose. They weren't really students, but they were almost commodities, right? Brought back to help generate revenue. So while they were brought back, athletes were still forced to isolate in order to limit the spread of COVID-19. And while, this hopefully kept them safe, it also hindered their development and their ability to engage with others as non-athletes were brought back. Even some other athletes in the athletics department and faculty members, things like that, who they had to isolate from in order for there to be a football and men's basketball season. Importantly, this is complicated because of the racial makeup of these teams are predominantly Black men and other men of color, and they're predominantly at institutions that are predominantly white, and also work with coaches who are predominantly white and athletics leaders that are also predominantly white. So football at the time of this data collection was roughly 55% of football teams in Division I identified as Black men or men of color. And with men's basketball, that percentage was even higher at 62%. So just a little context there as we go forward. So with this in mind, I wanted to see how football and men's basketball athletes understood their experience during the COVID-19 pandemic. So to do this, I chose the theoretical framework of social death. So it hasn't really been applied to athletics research recently, but it was more prominent in the 1980s, and it was exciting to sort of revisit it in the context of COVID-19. So social death describes when a person or group has experienced an extreme loss or an extreme or profound loss, particularly when it comes to a role, identity, or social networks. It's often used in literature that describes slavery, power dynamics, and forced labor, which many critical scholars have noted does align with the experiences of Black men in football and men's basketball particularly. There are three major themes of social death: this loss of identity that can also lead to sort of a liminal status, this loss of social connectedness from dislocation from their community, whether that's outside of athletics or even partially within athletics, disintegration of one's body, or really the lack of autonomy over one's body or lack of control there. With these themes and experiences are feelings of being used, exploited, and commodified, which ties back to what I mentioned earlier in that brief intro. And it's really is a unique and applicable theory to study football, men's basketball experiences during the pandemic. So to get us started, these athletes were enrolled from fall 2020 to fall 2021, and it included football and men's basketball athletes mainly. You can see football, and they were enrolled in an introduction to college athletics course at a Division I institution during the pandemic. You can also see that the athletes in this sample were also predominantly predominantly Black. They were given reflection essays in the class with the prompt, discuss your experience with the university and athletics department handling of COVID-19. They were not required to answer this question. They had plenty of other reflection essay prompts, and they were also granted confidentiality. And this was also part of an IRB approved study at this institution as well. So really tried to protect the students while also giving them choice whether or not to participate in this. I use deductive analysis based off a social death theory and use effective coding methods there. So you can see evaluation coding and emotion coding were the processes that I used. Evaluation coding is helpful in examining those interpersonal and intrapersonal experiences through reflections, really, again, to use the word evaluate how the athletics department and institution handled COVID. And then emotion coding was beneficial in examining their perceptions and judgments about the programs and policies that were in place at their institution, and their forced isolation there as well. So with that, these were the findings, and I'll go through each of these in a little bit more. You can see a general loss of power and control, which really stemmed from administrative COVID-19 policy enforcement, revenue generation, and power differences between athletes and coaches. And then also an identity loss, the unknown and uncertainty that came with COVID-19, mental health struggles, and sacrifices from that isolation and coming back. Then also the loss of social connection, this forced bubbling and isolating, loss of connections outside of athletics, and different treatment from athletes versus non-athletes, and particularly the isolation from family and loss of social connection, even within athletics as well. And then finally, disintegration of the body, feeling unsafe, noting that COVID-19 was dangerous. And many athletes even noted that they felt as if they were guinea pigs for the non-athletes who were not brought back to campus just yet. So going through these each on their own here. First is a general loss of power and control. And again, this stemmed from institution athletics departments, policies, and enforcements. Really, athletes noted the frequent testing, the requirements to continue to social distance, and the strict punishments that they either received or would receive for not following those rules. Revenue generation, and how they felt like this was at the heart of why they were brought back to school. And then finally, power discrepancies between athletes and coaches. So next, I'd really like to share a few quotes from these athletes. So a football athlete noted, the forced return of football was the first time I clearly saw my teammates and I as no longer students who play sports or even student athletes, but as property of the school in a way to make the school much needed money. And then for the power discrepancy, coaches risked catching COVID because they could go home to their spouses and children who are not being held to the same accountability as us. And this caused rifts between the players and coaches. And another football athlete noted that the season felt like a strain and the morale on his team was low, and football started to feel like a task, and they really didn't look forward to competing in football anymore, or at least during the pandemic there. And again, this ties back to, a little bit of loss of power overall. And then we have identity loss of the athletes. So this was rooted in the unknown uncertainty that, of course, we all probably felt during the pandemic, mental health struggles, and the sacrifices they felt they had to give in order to compete too. So a little bit, some more quotes here. Football athlete noted that they were naturally extroverted, so being isolated from everyone, including my teammates, was very difficult. At times, it had me down mentally ready to give up on college and football. I pushed through because of my love for football and the huge opportunity of attending an institution such as this institution. So this is an example of course, mental health struggles, but also sacrifice that this athlete felt because they wanted to receive this strong education, and play football, but that they had to sacrifice so much in order to do that. And then another football athlete noted, COVID-19 had me stressing and not feeling like myself or the player I was before. There's a disconnect between myself and the love of the game, and it didn't feel right during that pandemic. So again, we can see mental health struggles a little bit here, and also a loss of identity as being a football player, and even a little bit outside of that as well. Next was the loss of social connection, isolation from those inside athletics, other athletes. Oftentimes athletes were forced to be in their position group. So in men's basketball, all the guards had to be together compared to all the post players. In football, maybe it was the offensive line was together, and they couldn't engage with the running back group and things like that. And there was also isolation from those outside of athletics. Non-athlete friends and families were particularly prominent there. And this was perhaps the strongest theme, with 76% of athletes noted a loss of social connection during the pandemic in their bubbling. So some examples here from quotes. I'd get homesick often as I didn't make many friends my first year and felt the need to keep everything to myself. Again, this also connects a little bit with the mental health struggles with keeping everything to themselves. And also ties into what we now know about the pandemic being particularly hard for perhaps younger groups of students. Again, this was a second-year student, and they noted that in their first year, they didn't make a lot of friends, and now they're in their second year and they're still not making friends. So they're still having that loss of social connection. And then we have a men's basketball athlete noting, ultimately, we chose insert blank because we were isolated from a lot of students, and that gave us the best chance of having a basketball season. So that blank is choosing a particular dorm to live in. And it was just athletes, it was just those particular groups. But the downside to this decision was isolation from other students that were eventually allowed to come back to campus if they chose. And it was difficult to create and maintain relationships and friendships outside of the athletics program. This men's basketball athlete noted, I believe that meeting a lot of people with different interests and backgrounds is one of the most best parts of college. So not being able to took away from my college experience there. So again, lost the social connection both inside and outside of athletics. And finally, to wrap things up, the fourth theme was a disintegration of the body. And again, really not feeling safe and noting that COVID was dangerous. And then athletes perceiving that they were guinea pigs for the rest of the student body there. So next, we'll do some quotes. So men's basketball athlete, people's lives are much more than a one-year athletic season. Any person that values life and cares about others genuinely with a clear conscience would have said no way when deciding whether or not we should play during this pandemic. And then the football athlete noted, it has been portrayed to the football team and staff that we are the guinea pigs in a miniature experience to the possibility of not only having fall sports or returning students to campus. So again, feeling used, this lack of autonomy and power over one's own body did come through in some of the athletes' experiences. So moving along into some discussion and implications before I officially wrap up here, but the well-being of athletes must be recentered in college athletics. And we're starting to see particularly some issues with mental health coming forward with some of the more recent tragic deaths of college athletes. And the era we're entering of college athletics is only becoming more stressful and more turbulent with name, image, likeness, and a couple of other changes that really heighten the pressure on athletes. So we really need to move towards centering this well-being. And athletes in the sample did display key components of social death, particularly when it came to isolation, loss of identity, and loss of social connection as well. Still, some noted that this was just sort of part of what being a college athlete was. It was just part of their job. But we might note some of the paternalistic nature there and lack of true autonomy and understanding there. But what I thought was perhaps the most interesting finding here was athletes who were further removed from the COVID-19 playing season, the fall 2020, were a little more skeptical of decisions to return. And that might be you're further removed, you have more time to reflect. They might be older, so they're more mature. They might have read more negative press that was given to decisions to have athletes come back. Athletes also are gaining increased power and control in sports. But this is really more at the financial level. We like to think of name, image, likeness, and things like that. And it's less when it comes to their own identity development. So hopefully we can use this information to help athletes maintain their identities, particularly maintaining that identity and coping with it during times of crisis. Unlikely to experience something hopefully as extreme as COVID-19, but there are other smaller crises athletes have, particularly as they're transitioning out of sport. And this is when identity death and isolation from sports also emerges. So it's important that we can potentially use these findings to help athletes stay on track and maintain their identities inside and outside of sports as well. Finally, I really am a firm believer that athletes should have absolute control over their own bodies and power. The fact that they don't often stems from issues with paternalism, lack of understanding, maybe from being a little more immature or not learning as much yet. And then, of course, at the root of this is just athlete safety and well-being there. So here are some of my references, and I just wanted to say thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this video, and I'm looking forward to any questions you may have.